What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm Van Jackson. This is a special live stream edition of the show. It's live on Twitch, which is like the real impetus for this, like kicking off the new Twitch channel for the Undiplomatic Podcast. But it's also live streaming, or it should be, on YouTube. I have chat, I believe, open in both places, and it filters through. So if somebody jumps in the chat, I should be able to see it if I'm not, too distracted or hyped up about what I'm talking about. So the reason I wanted to do this specific episode was because there's a report out by CSIS and MIT. CSIS is classic, like, ruling class think tank. It's center right kind of neocon politics, like it's a site, SITE, of the national security state in that kind of politics. And so you have to take that as an understanding, or like the political context going into what they produce. MIT does very good analytical work, but it's very like technocratic and narrow. They rely on game theory and that kind of thing, and that weaves into what we're going to talk about, because this report that they did together, CSIS and MIT, it's called "Confronting Armageddon: Wargaming, Nuclear Deterrence, and Its Failures in a U.S.-China Conflict Over Taiwan." So let me see if I can share the screen here. So this report, it's quite long, and it's not a useful format to like parse a physical report over a video, medium. But they did an event that captures the report. It's like this big presentation. And so what I want to do, their presentation is like way too long, to be honest. But I'm going to walk through the first like 10 or 11 minutes of this presentation, because it's summarizing everything that was in the report. The details and the footnotes of the report just sort of reinforced this stuff that they say in the first 10 minutes. There's some insights here that I actually agree with, and I want to flag those as we go. But there's also some stuff I obviously disagree with, or that I want to put caveats on. So the larger context for this is that I'm doing, for years, I mean, maybe like half my career, wargaming, playing, facilitating war games, sometimes over North Korea, sometimes over Russia, mostly China-Taiwan conflict, right? So this is something I've spent like a shitload of time doing, not just in the Pentagon, but like afterwards when I was a think tanker, the same thing. I was doing a ton of Taiwan scenario-based analysis, and people who know my view of China, Taiwan, it's that a war there is really not winnable for the US in any meaningful sense, in any conventional sense. The balance of military forces there in that geography, because it's so close to the Chinese mainland, is impossible to overcome, really. And certainly there's no concept of like total victory that is possible. So because the balance of forces is unfavorable to the US, it raises this question of like, is the game worth the candle? Fighting in Taiwan? Does the idea of like deterrence and thinking and about war fighting over Taiwan in such an unwinnable geography, does this make any fucking sense at all? And with the understanding that you have to have war plans if you're going to have a military, they're not, I don't think, executable. They're not worth doing. The game is not worth the fucking candle, right? So I say that as a preface because one of the arguments that I've made over time is that, like, look, every way that we imagine fighting China over Taiwan is always using large numbers of missile strikes to hit the Chinese mainland, generally counterforce, which is to say targeting military targets, critical infrastructure, command and control, ports, airfields, that kind of shit, right? So every time we imagine fighting China, that's what we do. It's the only way that we can think about having a pathway to victory or doing deterrence or whatever, right? And the problem with that is that China is a nuclear state. It's a nuclear state with a secure second strike capability. It seems like the height of hubris that you would be able to launch missile strikes against meaningful targets, against their critical infrastructure and their ports and bases, and that they would just eat it and keep fighting a conventional conflict and not escalate to nuclear weapons, right? And it's playing with fate to think that you can target things like their command and control centers and that it's not going to accidentally or inadvertently hit a dual use target that China uses for its nuclear command and control. And in the classic sense, if you go after a nuclear state's nuclear command and control, it's fucked. Like, they have every incentive to use nuclear weapons before they lose them, because attacks on nuclear command and control is like disabling. It's easy to be read as a disabling first strike. So you put your enemy into like nuclear first use mindset when you do that, right? And so this is the larger meta problem with trying to like prescribe military solutions to what are really political problems, right? So with China Taiwan, the military solution is no solution at all for the US. And the willingness to fight against China for Taiwan necessarily requires that you accept the risk of nuclear escalation. And for most of my life, when I had seen war games played, when I had looked at this analysis, I had never seen any, especially war game about China Taiwan, address the risks of nuclear escalation. It's literally, you go look at old like CSBA reports and stuff, it's always this footnote that like, we assumed nuclear weapons would not be used when we did this game, the modeling of the conflict or whatever, right? It's always bracketed off. And that's super fucking silly and dangerous and irresponsible. And it it's the incoming assumption of like everything that the national security state does on China stuff. When they talk about war planning and invasion and deterrence and all this shit, the idea that you're going to do that against a nuclear state and bracket off nuclear weapons use is like pure insanity. It's irresponsible, you know? So this report by CSIS and MIT, that's the context, right? Like, they're actually doing the thing that everybody else bracketed off. But I should note, it's not the first time that like quote unquote serious people, defense intellectual types, have looked at nuclear risks over China Taiwan, right? Defense Priorities had a report, I think, in 2021 about nuclear escalation risks. There's been some good academic research about nuclear escalation risks when you strike counterforce targets, military targets, with conventional weapons, right? So there's a bunch of stuff. Ian Bowers, I think. Anyways, lots of research that's been done on this shit. But it's all stuff that gets ignored by like the national security state guys, like defense intellectual bros tend to not pay attention to that stuff because they can bracket it off in a footnote and then make arguments for like absurd levels of conventional advanced weapons, right? Anyway, so the CSIS MIT report, it's doing work that has been done before, but that has not really reached the right people in the national security state before. And because of who they are, the center right stuff, they are able to like speak in the grammar of the national security state and have those people listen, right? So that's the setup. I'm gonna play this clip thing, and then I'm gonna stop it intermittently to ad lib or to throw shade or whatever, right? To just to do this honestly. So here we go.
I want to give the bottom line up front so everybody knows where we're going. There are 4 things I want to emphasize in this summary. Nuclear weapons were used when one side thought it was facing catastrophic defeat on the conventional battlefield. The United States does not need to accept unfavorable outcomes. However, it is critical to give China a way out without forcing a choice between humiliating defeat and nuclear use. And finally, achieving a total victory, like overthrowing the CCP or disarming China, was not achievable when the adversary is armed with nuclear weapons. The research team developed the war game for a previous project.
Let me go back to that last slide. Okay, so this was their 4 bottom lines. I think you can see this, right? Nuclear use occurred most often when the Chinese invasion of Taiwan began to fail and China teams tried to restore their fortunes with nuclear weapons, right? Even in these extreme circumstances, the US could achieve favorable outcomes, but these required face-saving off-ramps for China. Total victory is not possible. Okay, so this is the thing I foot stomp historically for years. Total victory is not possible. Right? So what are the sort of intermediate objectives or the more modest ambitions that you would be trying to achieve, right? Probably just PLA withdrawal from Taiwan, or even like war termination, a cessation of war, regardless of whether the PLA establishes a foothold in Taiwan. But this face-saving off-ramps thing, off-ramps is like a kind of a thin concept. It's a jargon buzzword. It can mean too many things in too many contexts. So what it is, it just depends, right? But the idea that that you have to offer a way for China to like save face in order to de-escalate, that has been like a classical insight of deterrence theory shit going back to the 80s, you know? So there was this book by Janice Grostein and Bob Jervis, I think, called Psychology and Deterrence. The whole thing was like about the only ability to manage deterrence in conflicts really is when you have the ability to save face, when you don't put your enemy into a corner, right? And so what does that look like? Well, who the fuck knows? They talk about a couple examples in this report, but the need to take into account enemy psychology in a serious way, like strategic empathy is a phrase that means too many stupid things. But the idea that like you would need to consider that seriously, analytically, is valid, right? And the other thing I should point out here is that they say, as the thing says on the bottom line here, the most likely path, or that's maybe bad language, the most conceivable path to nuclear escalation involves scenarios where China's waging the conventional war, it's launching an amphibious assault of Taiwan or whatever, but then it is losing. And it's when it's losing, but it's already committed to its military objectives, that's when you're most likely to see nuclear use. And there was a report that I was part of a project by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, APLN. It's a long fucking phrase name, but they did a report. I was the author of it earlier this year about nuclear risk reduction. I'll throw it in show notes or something for this episode. And then that report was part of, it was year 3 of the 3-year project on this same thing, but it was about nuclear risk reduction in Northeast Asia. For that report, we looked at fucking 30 scenarios of nuclear escalation in Northeast Asia, right? They disproportionately focused on North Korea because the risks of nuclear escalation are greater with North Korea. But we looked at China-Taiwan scenarios too. And what we found in that report was this same insight, which is that you're most likely to see China escalate to nuclear weapons after a conventional assault on Taiwan has started, but its fortunes have turned negative and it looks like it's going to fucking lose the battle, right? And so it's then when leadership thinks that it's worth gambling with nukes, right? You've got this ace up your sleeve or whatever, and it's not serving you any purpose, and you're desperate, so you might as well try to use it. It's politically that important to you to achieve your military objectives in Taiwan. So, okay. So that is something I agree with. Basically, like, these 4 bottom lines are not new. So this project that these guys are doing, CSIS and MIT, they played 15 war games of the same kind of scenario, basically, right? Well, the report that we did earlier this year, like I said, 30 scenarios, right? So, and we're finding a similar thing here, which is that if the U.S. military starts to turn the tide, even though the balance of power is unfavorable for the U.S. in Taiwan, if that shit happens, that's the precise scenario when China's most likely to escalate to nuclear weapons, right? So it's like, we're either going to fight for Taiwan and fucking lose, or we're going to win. And the more we win, the higher the likelihood of nuclear escalation, which is why it's important to foot stomp that total victory is not possible, like it says on their slide here, right? All right, so let's keep it going.
Was not achievable when the adversary is armed with nuclear weapons.
It should be obvious.
The research team developed the war game for a previous project to examine a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. This project made several adaptations, including the possibility of using nuclear weapons. The 2 research questions ask why adversaries might use nuclear weapons and what happens when they do. On the disclaimers, I want to emphasize that everything, the research and the resulting products, came completely from unclassified sources.
I should say this is some boring shit, but it's worth saying that, like, all war games are fictitious. They're fictions, right? They're not real. And so therefore they're liable to be wrong. You can almost assume that they're wrong, right? The question is, what analytical utility do you get out of this? And so when you look at these research questions, these are sort of broadly drawn and vague. You know, there's a bunch of insights in the academic literature that would be able to answer these questions rigorously and logically, but policymakers, I don't know, they get off on war games. So the idea that you're going to run a war game to answer these questions is not unreasonable, but it's also not necessary because of all the research that we've already got, you know? And so the findings from the war game are kind of most useful if they present sort of counterintuitive insights.
I also want to emphasize that although many participants held or had held senior positions in government, gameplay reflected their personal judgments and not any plan of the U.S. government.
No shit. So that's just disavowing responsibility for the analysis. All right. I didn't look at who funded this, but I'm almost certain it would be funded by a Department of Defense organization.
The report discusses the game mechanics in detail. I'll give a quick overview here. It's a physical game with about 1,000 pieces. Here are the operational maps where players move their air and naval forces. The game begins with a conventional conflict. There's a ground map of Taiwan where the ground campaign takes place. And finally, there's a nuclear status map where players could change their nuclear posture and decide to use nuclear weapons.
That's a smart
Teams
little
were not
token.
required.
That's I'm not advocating wargaming here, but like I do teach wargaming, and this is having a nuclear forces status map is an interesting thing because it's like it lets you visualize the different choices you might make about nuclear posture. So that's kind of a novel thing.
To use nuclear weapons, and many did not, but some did. Scoping conditions are important in understanding what the war game does and does not do. The key limitation is that the political dimension was not fully represented, and therefore the frequency of nuclear use might be different in the real world.
Holy fuck. So like in order, like war games are already wrong, as in not representative of reality intrinsically because of like what they are. But the idea that you're going to bracket off political considerations is one of these scoping limitations, one of these assumptions that boggles the fucking mind. Like that's the part that you should be simulating hardest. You know what I mean? Especially when one of the actors in the game is America and American politics is crazy and corrupt and highly volatile and not fully competent when it comes to this national security shit, bro. So this is a huge constraint here. Political considerations limited. Which means they didn't model or game that out. They made simplifying assumptions about politics. And what I think that really means in a game like this is that all these fucking guys, these suits, these DC suits, they are thinking in terms of like it's like Bill Clinton's running America or something. Unipolar moment shit. They assume a competent imperial executive, and bestriding the world with that sort of, I don't know, competence, advantages, etc. So that's a problem. Like the idea that you would strip out the politics from this, super problematic.
We believe that the nuclear dynamics represented here provide useful insights, but readers cannot take the number of nuclear uses, divide by the number of games, and conclude that that is the percentage of nuclear use in a future crisis.
So what he's saying there is just, I try to tell this to people all the time, and when I've said this to media people, they don't fucking listen, or they want to stop the interview basically. But like, what you cannot assign probabilities or likelihoods to nuclear risks, to nuclear escalation, in Taiwan or anywhere, because it's one of these. It's not like playing a game of cards where you have clear probability distributions because you can see the frequency of certain outcomes occurring. So like you can't to say that like there's a 60% chance of nuclear escalation if we do this. That's just a subjective probability. It's not an objective probability. So the language, the way that we talk about this stuff, to talk in terms of likelihoods or probabilities, it happens because of the way that humans characterize shit, but it's not correct to do that technically. And so when we talk about nuclear instability and we're worried about those possibilities, we should be thinking in terms of risk or risk factors, not probabilities, not likelihoods. So risk factors, it's like when you think about like a cancer diagnosis, like you're at risk for cancer. A doctor cannot really give you an objective probability of like the likelihood that you're going to get cancer, or if he does, it doesn't fucking mean anything. But he can say, well, you've got this hereditary risk factor, you've got this smoking risk factor, you've got this fatness, obesity risk factor, whatever. And then the chances that you're going to get cancer are through the roof because you have these compounding risk factors and they're all lit up. They're all green light, And so that's the kind of way to think about nuclear escalation. It's like, are certain risks active or heightened or not, So that's all he means there.
There was no Taiwan team because the operational decisions available were limited. However, this meant that we assumed that Taiwan would continue to resist. There was no mechanism for Taiwan to surrender.
Holy fucking shit again. Like, that's crazy, right? So you're wargaming. This is the you know, the people that we claim to defend don't matter shit. Taiwan does not matter to the national security state. It's an object, it's a site. And that's proof, that like I get that Taiwan doesn't have nukes. And if you're doing this game to understand nuclear dynamics, then you might, that's clearly where this assumption comes from. They assume that they don't need a Taiwan team, right? But that's crazy. Like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro was super, super extra about willingness to escalate to nuclear use, or like encouraging the Soviet Union to escalate to nuclear use, right? And Castro didn't own nukes himself, but it was a huge factor, and it weighed on decision makers in Moscow. And so you should expect the same kind of thing here. Like Washington is very open kimono about the influence of foreign powers, foreign nations, and like Taiwan is very influential on the US foreign policy community. So like surely what Taiwan is saying or doing really directs what happens in a big way. Not 100%, but like it's a shaping force. There's no question. It's got to be. And so if Taiwan wants to surrender and it's lobbying for that, because it doesn't want to keep getting pounded by, conventional weapons or nukes or something, then like that should be decisive, and to bracket that off or to not play those dynamics seems, again, like I get how they might have made that choice, but that seems irresponsible. And just the idea that you would erase Taiwan as an actor in a scenario that's about Taiwan seems, very troubling to me. I see somebody in the chat. Parallel to Russia losing Crimea. Yeah, that's the problem. Like, it's China's most likely to, I mean, right now, like I don't think Putin's going to use nukes, but he's most likely to use nukes if he's losing on the battlefield, right? So it's again, we can't assign probabilities to these things, but the risks are greater in that instance. Let's keep it going here. We're like halfway through.
Many commentators note that China might take other actions against Taiwan other than direct invasion. We don't disagree. If that were to occur, nuclear use would follow a different path, however. And finally, the Wargames assumed that war had been decided on, but we are not arguing that war is inevitable. However, wars do occur for a variety of reasons, from misestimating the military balance to believing that events were working against them. The Chinese nuclear buildup, the Chinese military buildup and nationalist rhetoric makes such a conflict plausible, but by no means inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that's on display here, and that whole like plausible but not inevitable thing, this whole game, and this is one of the problems with war games, is that it's cherry picking into a stress test. Like a stress test is trying to identify the hardest situation and then focus on that, right? And so if it goes wrong, you end up using that insight or that finding to make recommendations for more cowbell, more investments in whatever. It's always more, never less investments in some military hardware shit, but that's like to be expected. But the problem is like the game is assuming its way into that worst case scenario. So we like that whole pathway that matters most. We're trying to prevent war and then we end up in war. That's the part that really deserves the most exploration. The idea that like you're going to kind of skip over that to focus on the nuclear escalation dynamics directly, I guess it needs to be done if you're going to be involved in this military planning stuff, but it's not great, like and it's misleading. Like the very premise of this game and the fact that it exists in the discourse or whatever it intensifies this militarist imagination in Washington. Like there's such a fetish around thinking about China in terms of a Taiwan conflict and thinking about Taiwan conflict in terms of battlefield victory. And like these doing these games, like everybody's doing these games. The games are done on Capitol Hill, the Department of Defense and the intelligence community are hosting games like this all the time. There's so like hundreds of these things. What does that do to your psyche? What you know what it does? It creates this feeling of inevitability, that 2027 or bust bullshit, right? Everybody, people who aren't China experts, people who aren't Asia experts, but they know they're experts at imagining ways to kill, and they feel validated by all of this, and then this creates this air of inevitability, and this is part of what has poisoned China policy and US foreign policy generally. It's fucking sick shit. All right, let's go.
This is a very complex chart, which is explained in detail in the report. It shows how the 15 games all started at the same place, but proceeded along many different pathways. I'll make 2 points. The first thing to note is that there were 5 different outcomes shown along the right side of the chart. 3 outcomes were most important. PLA enclave, which allowed the Chinese to maintain an enclave on Taiwan as a result of the invasion. PLA withdrawal, which allowed a defeated Chinese force to retreat from the island. And conflagration, where the 2 sides climbed the nuclear escalation ladder and ended with a general nuclear exchange.
Okay, this I don't know how well you can see this, but it's fucking insane. So what they're saying is like, okay, we did these 15 games. In each one, we assume that war happens, right? And sometimes it turns out okay-ish, and then sometimes it turns out into nuclear Armageddon, right? And when it goes from one to the other, it's not the path is not reliable, or like you can't predict which outcome you end up in necessarily. So one of the early nuclear uses that frequently happened here was hemp bursts. So I don't know if you guys know hemp, high altitude electromagnetic pulse. So it's like when you throw up a nuke in the sky and detonate it, and then it has this mass destructive power over electricity grids and comms and that kind of thing. Super, super dangerous and damaging. And it sort of punctures the nuclear taboo. Like it breaks through that, and it's because it is nuclear use. And it can have very devastating effects. Right. But like they said in the key finding, the sort of most likely path, again, not great language there, but the most likely path to nuclear use was China going first because its back was against the wall, because it was losing. So like bro in the chat says it correctly, like the more you win conventionally, you being the US, the more likely you are to lose because they'll turn to their only option left. Right. That's the fucking, and like the thing is, this is what they're finding in the game. This is shit that we have known for like 20 years. And we knew this in terms of like academic theory. We knew this in terms of like old war games and scenarios. We knew this in terms of common sense. That's common sense, right? So anyways, sometimes you have to use a war game to validate common sense. I don't know. Let's see. So the conflagration is an outcome. Conflagration is nuclear Armageddon. That's what they mean. So we're exchanging multiple salvos of nuclear use, and the most likely, this is again a useful insight I think from this. The most likely way that we end up in nuclear Armageddon is if the U.S. launches counter-value targeting. So targeting industrial centers, civilian populations, using nukes to target non-military targets, right? That is, of course, going to elicit nuclear retaliation. And when China starts using nukes against us, of course, we're probably going to use nukes back. And that's how we end up in, the sum of all fears or whatever. And then PRC enclave is one of the outcomes that happened in the game sometimes. This is an outcome that we have to we have to be willing to accept it under certain conditions because the alternative is nuclear Armageddon. So PRC enclave just means that like China's amphibious assault on Taiwan is successful enough that they're able to use that to have a military presence on Taiwan, right? So that's not a great outcome, but it's probably a better outcome than World War III, you know. So it is what it is. This is the possibilities. And then there were some scenarios that they saw in the game where the PLA was able to partially withdraw troops from Taiwan or conduct a phased withdrawal of troops from Taiwan, and that helped de-escalate the situation. But in order for that to happen, we had to introduce policies and decisions, face-saving off-ramps, if you will, in order for that to happen. You know, so these are the types of outcomes that resulted. And I just want to foot stomp again in the APLN report that I was the author of earlier this year. 30 scenarios we looked at. One of the ones that we modeled quantitatively in depth was a China-Taiwan conflict. And the big finding there was that China used nukes when it was losing the conventional fight. Could not foot stomp that enough. Let's keep going.
Another point is how uncertain the paths were, the uncertainty of the paths and where they would end up once they started. Now I'll turn the floor over to Eric for his part of the briefing.
In the report, we outline a number of findings and recommendation. I'll just touch on 4 of those.
I should say as a caveat, like I'm not trying to dunk on these humans necessarily. Like these guys are like considered serious defense intellectuals in Washington. They're not my kind of people, obviously, but they do rigorous real work. The problem I have with them is that they're obsessed with these dark militarist imaginaries. They spend all their time in the darkest crevices of humanity. And like that really distorts your sense of reality, you know? And it's like there's a self-fulfilling prophecy quality to all of this stuff. And they tend to be blind to it. So I just wanted to say like these people are doing real analysis and good analysis by the standards of Washington. That doesn't mean that the insights that they're providing are all good or that there aren't blind spots, you know, or things worth critiquing. And that's why I'm doing this, because like there is shit here that's worth critiquing. All right.
Today, the first finding is that the games demonstrate a need for diplomatic flexibility and off-ramps. There were no unconditional victories for either side in the conflict. In the games, one of 2 things happened. Either off-ramps were offered at some point in the conflict and the other side agreed, or the teams pressed for total victory with catastrophic consequences. One of our recommendations then is that off-ramps should be a regular part of U.S. planning and wargaming. State Department personnel should be involved in these activities and should be more than mere window dressing. In considering off-ramps, planners should look to achieve important U.S. objectives, but provide at least face-saving means for the adversary to exit conflict.
So again, like the importance of off-ramps, the trouble of off-ramps is that, again, they're like so capacious. What does that really mean? You know, that can be like the back channel diplomacy. It can be military restraint, unilateral restraint. It can be a negotiated settlement, you know, withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey shit in the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, there's so many ways to cash out that. And so it's like very context contingent, but it's still important, you know? And if you're going in with maximalist objectives, then everybody dies. And it's just that simple. And I feel like it's useful that they are sort of validating that. You know, the other thing I should mention is like the APLN report that I did earlier this year. The big finding out of that from analyzing 30 scenarios, right, of nuclear escalation, it was like the bumper sticker that we had coming out was that one man's deterrence is another man's escalation. And that like it's kind of that simple. And so if you're trying to amass force or project force, like use force, in the name of deterrence, you're feeding all of the risks of escalation. You're heightening those risks. Super problematic. And when we play out war games like what these CSIS MIT guys are doing, we see that. We see it in evidence, you know? So it's one of these obvious things that should induce caution in us, but it doesn't seem to have the cautious effect because everybody's obsessed with this military shit all the time. I see in the chat, somebody says, given the problems with war games, or that I have with war games, do you think there are better tools to be used for making strategic decisions? War games, it's like, it depends on how you use it and how you set it up and what you're using it for, you know? Like these guys have a very narrow agenda, and it's about nuclear posture, nuclear modernization. It skips over all of the crisis diplomacy stuff. Like it went straight into war, you know? And so the idea, like the big dilemma that we're facing in the real world over China stuff is like, how much do we design policy to prevent war versus to optimize for war? And the way like Uber hawks and militarists think about this stuff, they try to flatten or collapse or conflate the distinction. They say like the Roman adage, if you want peace, prepare for war. So they try to dress themselves up in like, we're just doing deterrence in order to prevent war. We prevent war by doing deterrence. But by doing deterrence, we mean fucking arms racing and gunboat diplomacy and even limited uses of force, you know, which starts conflating compellence and deterrence, but whatever. So like, that's a huge problem. My fucking dogs are going crazy. So like wargaming can be part of the solution, but like you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. And I think it's like the least useful method for generating public conversations, because the public doesn't get any insight into the various assumptions that you made and whether those are valid, the framing that you set up, right? Like in this game, in these games that these guys did, they had no Taiwan actor. They at all. They bracketed off politics, quote unquote. It's all politics, right? And so like those are the two most, and then of course they skipped over the crisis to go straight to war. So like those are the 2-3 most important factors that people would want to know about. But if your interest in the game in the first place is, you know, whether to validate this $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization project that America has undertaken, well, you need to skip over all that stuff. And so this important dilemma in the real world, prevent war or optimize for war, that's the real choice. And these kinds of games kind of obscure that, you know, and the game, a war game itself is not even very useful for facing that choice. Do we try to prevent war or do we try to optimize for it? What the national security state does, what these guys are doing, is making recommendations for how to optimize for war, you know, now, and that, so it's inherently problematic, but that doesn't mean there's no insights here. You know, it's just like, you've got to be cautious about what insights you take on board or where they're coming from. And so that's, again, what I'm trying to sort of do here. There are other methods that you can use though, right? Historical comparison. You can do scenario-based analysis that's not war games, like an alternative futures analysis, you know, lots of shit. That's probably to cover for another day, actually. But let me keep going here.
In the games, this sometimes involves allowing China to evacuate isolated soldiers rather than forcing them to surrender.
So there's an example of a face-saving off-ramp allowing the PLA to evacuate some of its soldiers, or like injured soldiers especially, right?
The second finding is that the prospect of imminent defeat was the most important driver of nuclear use.
There we go.
Some call this kind of nuclear use gambling for resurrection. China.
This is also the most likely way that North Korea ends up using nuclear weapons in Korea-based war scenarios.
often found itself in trouble during the conventional fight. By weeks 3 or 4, its amphibious fleet was often largely destroyed, and the China side therefore initiated nuclear use more often than the US did.
Sometimes produced general nuclear war. Isn't that problematic? Are there any situations where it's acceptable to risk general nuclear war? If that's on the table as a possible outcome, is it worth it? Who has the right to fucking decide whether we end up in general nuclear war? Nobody should have that right, you know?
China's initial nuclear attacks were invariably directed primarily at operational targets on Taiwan. True to the term gambling for resurrection, the game results suggested that nuclear use was very much a roll of the iron dice. That is, using nuclear weapons sometimes improved the outcome for the side employing those weapons. But in 3 cases, escalation ultimately produced general nuclear war, a cataclysm that would have killed hundreds of millions.
3 out of 15 cases produced outcomes that killed hundreds of millions of people. That is fucking insane. One of the fissures or cleavages between me and the national security bros world that I came from is that I don't think we have a right to go down any path where 3 out of 15 times we end up killing hundreds of millions of people. Fuck you. Fuck that.
It may sound obvious that conventional defeat would drive nuclear use, but there are a number of other theories about what might cause nuclear deterrence to fail, and those either did not prove true or played only secondary roles in the games. For example, the availability of tactical nuclear weapons is sometimes said to tempt nuclear use and make it more likely.
Okay, so this is actually fascinating. What they frame this as dogs that did not bark. What they're saying is like in the academic literature, in previous research that other scholars have done, one of the frequent concerns or the big risk factors of nuclear escalation is the presence of tactical nuclear weapons, non-strategic nuclear weapons, which is the, fancy way of saying nuclear warheads that have low yields for detonation. So like they could, the size can vary to be the same destructive effect as just a conventional missile or something. But it can also be much larger, who knows? But it's just non-strategic nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons is a term of art. And the general belief is that tactical nuclear weapons might be seen as more usable than quote unquote strategic nuclear weapons. There's people who say that this distinction is stupid or this distinction is not even real. A nuke is a nuke is a nuke. And there's a way in which that's true, but the thinking, especially by countries like North Korea, Pakistan, the thinking that if you have a low yield nuclear weapon, it lets you it's like just the tip, like it lets you dip your toe in to nuclear escalation. And that's a bad way of thinking because a nuke is a nuke is a nuke. But we don't control how other governments think about their nuclear arsenals, And so there's always been this lingering concern that having tactical nuclear weapons in your arsenal means that you view them as basically usable nuclear weapons, whereas higher yield nukes maybe are less usable or ICBMs are less usable. So what they found in this game was that the availability of TAC nukes did not affect nuclear escalation as an outcome. And that's super interesting because if TAC nukes are not more usable than other nukes, then we don't really benefit from developing them. We don't need them. Our enemy doesn't need them. If a nuke is a nuke, then the sort of yield on it doesn't make that big of a difference necessarily, right? So that's how I would read this finding, right? The presence of TAC nukes, the ability to use TAC nukes does not necessarily affect nuclear escalation. I would say that means that we don't need TAC nukes at all, right? It might be another. There might be another way to read that, but that's what I would take away from it. The other thing here is that they found that attacks on nuclear or dual use systems did not affect nuclear escalation. In the games that they did, because of their scoping assumptions, it was because he might say this in a minute, but it was because China's nuclear second strike capability, its retaliatory capability, was safe. And so attacking, a command and control center or something for conventional forces and for nukes, well, that didn't necessarily lead to nuclear escalation because there were other factors already leading to nuclear escalation. And the big feeling of imminent threat would be if China was losing its secure second strike capability. And in the 15 games they did, they never targeted China's secure second strike nuclear capability. So China always retained the ability to retaliate, and sometimes they did, right? And then on the tactical nuke thing real quick, that initial assumption about we're bracketing off politics. We took the politics out of nuclear decision making. Like, that kind of assumption is going to jaundice or color this outcome about the relationship between tactical nuclear weapons and nuclear escalation, right? If tactical weapons are usable nukes, quote unquote, the politics is the ultimate determiner of whether you use those nukes. And so, like, to bracket off politics, problematic, again, it just like lowers our confidence in the overall findings here. And the confidence of findings in war games to begin with is not necessarily great. Let's keep going.
Played two different variants of China's nuclear arsenal. In one case, China had low-yield weapons available to it, and in one, they did not. China teams did consider available weapons yields, especially when discussing potential targets that were near Taiwanese cities. But yields were not a decisive consideration in those cases. Another body of literature suggests that conventional attacks on nuclear or dual-use systems could cause inadvertent escalation to the nuclear level. While we don't dismiss that possibility, we did not see those dynamics in the games. We did vary U.S. rules of engagement, and some games did see attacks against strategic assets. But in all cases, the side being attacked, which was generally China, judged that its essential second strike capability remained intact.
So just like I said.
Nor did the exhaustion of high-end conventional missiles drive nuclear use. Both sides ran through their missiles quickly, but still had other means of continuing the fight.
So that may seem like, that last insight may seem like a throwaway, or like, what's the point of mentioning that? The think tank world, these NatSec bros, they have focused a lot the past few years on the question of like inventory of missiles, of conventional munitions. And CSIS itself produced a report a couple years ago arguing that, like, and this is why people talk about the defense industrial base so much, partly is because, like, or we don't make things in America anymore, like all that manufacturing fetish stuff. It has everything to do with the ability to stockpile enough munitions to wage a protracted war. What we find is that in the real world, like on the Ukraine battlefield, but also in the hypothetical imaginary of like a Taiwan conflict or a Korea conflict, we end up always running out of munitions within a couple weeks, sometimes a few days, depending on the scenario. And so, like, we don't have the ability to wage a protracted war in the way that we would imagine planning for that protracted war. So there's a supply constraint. I actually think it's good that we're not able to do protracted wars. It makes us hopefully less likely to pursue them. But your mileage may vary, and in Washington they see that as a bad thing, and they want to be able to do protracted wars. So that's why he's even mentioning this.
A third finding was that different U.S. responses to Chinese nuclear first use carried different types of risks and benefits. None of the U.S. teams simply decided to cut and run in the face of Chinese nuclear use. That course would carry the least or lowest nuclear risk, but was seen as having excessive reputation and political cost to the U.S. position in Asia and the globe.
Okay, that may be one of the most meaningful things that came out of this whole project, and it reveals the sort of ideological blind spot of this whole project that these guys are doing, right? They could not, the thing that was most likely to manage or reduce escalation in their games was withdrawal, cutting and running, or whatever, however they phrased it, right? But it was basically like, if the US de-escalates in a Taiwan conflict, that guarantees that there will be no nuclear war, right? And the reason that they don't do that, let me bring the screen back up here, is because it would be a risk to the US international position. So again, I said in the beginning, the way that these guys are thinking about America here is as the unipolar moment kind of thing. Like, they're imagining this competent, coherent executive branch, the imperial presidency, wielding power in the world system as a kind of hegemon, right? Like, who cares about something as abstract as America's quote unquote position in Asia and the world? It's quote unquote reputation. What is America's reputation while it's on the wrong side of a fucking genocide in Gaza? And it's unrepentant about it. Unrepentant. It's violating international law and US law in order to aid that genocide, right? All that shit is connected. Like, and under the Trump presidency, already we know that he wants to do things like pull troops out of Korea and whatever or in Japan, and whatever you think of that. Part of the point is that he's trying to extort allies. He's purposely not reliable as an ally. So, like, that's the reality of our politics. Our politics makes us unreliable and incompetent on national security shit. And these guys in this project, this war game shit, they're assuming the opposite. They're assuming we live in the fucking Aaron Sorkin West Wing. You know what I mean? And that just ain't true. And so the thing that we would need to do, which is military restraint and partial accommodation, figure out how to get to yes, get to peace. We can't do that because, and in the game, they never did that because it would risk our international position, our position in Asia. What the fuck does that mean? That's nothing. That's hubris.
Attempting to fight on conventionally was another option, but that generally led to further nuclear use by China and therefore produced poor operational and political outcomes.
One man's deterrence is another man's escalation.
At the other end of the spectrum, responding with nuclear weapons against targets in China proper proved highly escalatory. In every case where Chinese cities were hit, escalation occurred that led to general nuclear war.
Okay. Again, this echoes previous research on this by me and by others. If you hit Chinese cities with missiles, it leads to general nuclear war. This is fucking obvious. MLS mainland strikes, maybe you can hit certain military targets that are not very important and it won't lead to nuclear escalation. But the problem here is that if you're hitting targets that aren't very important, you're not winning in a military sense. So it goes back to the dilemma. One of the guys in the chat, this is the essence. The more you win conventionally, the more likely you are to lose overall, because escalation is the most likely result, nuclear escalation. And nobody wins a nuclear war, bro. So this is the trouble. And there's no scenario in my experience, including in these guys, these guys did 15 fucking war games of this shit. Also in my experience, but also in these 15 games, there's no scenario where we fight China, but don't launch tons of missiles at the Chinese mainland. And if we're doing tons of missiles on the Chinese mainland, we're asking for general nuclear war. There's a possibility it doesn't happen depending on which targets we hit, but we're asking for it. And we don't have a right to ask for that. All right. Almost done here.
Targeting Chinese military units on Taiwan, on the other hand, led to war termination on more positive terms. As an aside, Chinese warships around Taiwan are sometimes said to be lucrative nuclear targets, but for a number of reasons, U.S. teams' responses tended to favor attacks on land units rather than ships at sea. There's a lot more to say about each of these possible.
There's not a ton that I want to say about that, but it's interesting that the game players, who are, again, we're all like former U.S. government people, that they didn't try to target Chinese ships or like naval assets. They were trying to still target ground forces, right? They're still trying to target territorial targets, right? Which is, that's more escalatory. And so it's weird that they chose that, but they, whatever. They
Possible responses to Chinese nuclear first use, and we do so in the report. Our recommendation is that well-considered and robust branch plans are critical. Finally,
okay. Recommend branch plans for war planning, for contingency plans, for O plans. So what they mean by that is like they want to make sure, they're recommending that war plans have an annex or an addendum that addresses nuclear use, because conventional military war plans are conventional, non-nuclear, right? So nuclear planning and normal conventional war planning are thought of as like separate silos generally, in part because in a conventional war plan, you can assume or plan to have total victory. You can set objectives and then you kill enough people to achieve those objectives, right? And then game over. But in a nuclear war plan, there is no total victory and there's a good chance of total destruction. So the planning assumptions that you make and the scope of your objectives and everything, it's just different, you know? So it's, nuclear plans and war plans, conventional plans, none of that stuff is public. So who knows what the government has in this regard, or what they're already doing. But the CSIS report is making this common sense sort of, hey, if we're going to do conventional war planning, we need to have like nuclear branch plans or annexes that take into consider nuclear use. And like, of course, that's true, right?
a fourth and final finding is that U.S. nuclear advantage neither deterred China from using nuclear weapons nor proved particularly useful in nuclear bargaining after first use.
Boom. This is like a big fuck you to Bridge Colby and Matt Kroenig and all those fucking guys. The nuclear hawks, the nuclear primacists. So this may seem esoteric, or like maybe this is too inside baseball, but like in the nuclear community, there's like different types of nuclear strategists, and there are these like super wonky debates that I mean, normal people don't care about this shit at all because it's all bad. But there's like one school, there's like 4 different schools of thought. I've written about this. The one school of thought, though, is nuclear primacists, and they believe that America needs to have nuclear superiority over all of its fucking adversaries, especially China. And so it needs to dominate the quote unquote escalation ladder. And the belief is that if you have nuclear superiority, you will have coercive advantages over your enemy. And this is not true. And lots of nuclear scholars and nuclear strategists disagree with that. But it's one of these edgy arguments, you know, that like like Uberhawks make, neocons make, right? And so the 1.9 trillion dollar nuclear modernization project that America has undertaken, it's being undertaken partly on the belief that, you know, America needs nuclear primacy, basically. But there are advocates, paradoxically, there are advocates for nuclear modernization that are not nuclear primacists. And this CSIS report is not nuclear primacist. But as it says on the slide, or what he's about to tell us, is that like this report rubber stamps the $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization project. It says it right there on the slide, and he's probably going to mention it in a second verbally. But there's edge capabilities, or like capabilities on the margins, like nuclear variants of the Tomahawk land attack cruise missile, TLAM-N. There's stuff like that where the nuclear primicists say, yes, we need that as part of nuclear primacy. And there are nuclear strategists who are more like Brent Scowcrofty, like conservative in a center-right sense. And that's kind of what these guys are. So once again, like I said, at the very beginning of this shit, very beginning, these guys, this is a ruling class think tank doing center-right sort of national security state ideological work. And so, of course, they're going to recommend executing this ginormous 30-year nuclear modernization plan, even though it encourages Chinese nuclear arms racing, right? Even though like China's not going to just sit still while we're modernizing our arsenal to such a degree, right? So that's to be expected, right? I don't think that that's actually a conclusion that you draw from the analysis in this report. I think this is a statement of ideology, a statement of the status quo. But and like the nuclear primacy folks like Bridge, like Matt Kroenig, they support the nuclear modernization too, but they support a plussed up version of it. So that like TLAM-N, there's a couple capabilities that they want that are not inherently built into the modernization plan, or that are but are not funded, And so this internal debate between like these guys, like, to put it simply, center right wonks and far right wonks, they disagree about a couple little things on the margins, and that's what's being teased here. What's at issue, but they agree with the thrust. And the thrust is what I think is fucked. The thrust is fucking the whole game, makes the whole game not worth the candle, Almost done.
As long as the China teams believed that they had a survivable second strike capability, which they always did, they were confident that they could engage in nuclear bargaining.
Not a fan of
Indeed, some
Colby.
teams did that quite successfully. Overall, the conventional balance, and especially the situation on Taiwan, had a greater impact on bargaining leverage. We recommend that the current nuclear modernization plans be executed, but also conclude that expanding the arsenal beyond that point is unlikely to provide decisive leverage in a conflict with China.
Now that is a statement that nuclear superiority does not matter, is not essential, does not confer advantages, either in war or in bargaining over war, right? So they're basically saying, look, we've got this 30-year, $1.7 trillion modernization project, B-21, yada, yada, updating the nuclear triad. They're validating that, but they're like, we don't need to go further than that. We don't get any benefit by going further than that. So to me, that's a pretty maximalist position already, but at least it's drawing a line in the sand against the Bridges and the Kroenigs is how Brands is.
Again, this is a selective set of points we've discussed, and we invite you to download and read the report, which has...
All right. That's enough of that shit. Yeah. So one man's deterrence is another man's escalation. There is no way of imagining a conflict over Taiwan so far that doesn't involve large numbers of mainland strikes against the Chinese mainland. And that's super fucking dangerous, right? And when you target Chinese cities, it leads to general nuclear war, full stop, right? And in 3 out of 15 of their cases, they ended up in general nuclear war, right? Hugely problematic. And I feel like we're doing all these wargaming activities about China, and those activities themselves, the war games themselves, are expressions of the tragic belief that war is inevitable. It's skipping over everything that matters to focus on the one thing that doesn't matter, The one thing that doesn't matter is this boom goes this way, boom goes that way in a war where nuclear weapons are at risk of use. That's what we have to prevent at all costs. These games foreclose on the possibility that we can prevent war. They skip straight to war, and then they look at, okay, how can we do war without total annihilation? That's what they're trying to find, the Goldilocks military solution to what is ultimately a political problem. And that's super fucked. Okay. One thing I should say as I close out here is that this fucking event that they're doing, this video goes on for another hour, but I looked through most of it and it didn't say a lot that was useful. And some of the other guests that they brought on to talk, they make some of the points that I make, frankly. So, no need to cover it here. But again, one man's deterrence is another man's escalation. Don't forget that. And I should say, wargaming, as much as I'm like poo-pooing it here, I'm poo-pooing it partly because all of these assumptions that they're making, you can make different assumptions and serve better purposes. That, like, part of my beef is that they're using wargaming to optimize for war, to do everything possible to position themselves advantageously in a war, even at the expense of war prevention, because they're not even looking at war prevention. And so if you made different assumptions, I've done peace games before. It was like war games where you're trying to figure out how to build peace or make peace. So it's not about crisis and killing and conflict. It's literally about the opposite over longer time periods. It's not just like the fog of war shit. That's doable. That, like, wargaming can serve that purpose too. And so it's really that, like, we're not doing enough wargaming about war prevention. It's all about let's assume war happens. So that's troubling in itself. But even so, the game's value is less for the public discussion stuff and more for internal decision making. So the people who are making the sausage inside the machine, they need to be looking at war games that are focused on peaceful outcomes or building peace, or choosing different configurations of policy and industrial policy and economic statecraft in order to build the foundation for a new détente with China that accommodates the emerging multipolarity in Asia, rather than insisting on US primacy. If you're doing games with those purposes, those would be useful things to undertake. But again, when you're putting those into the public discussion, it gets so stripped down and the assumptions are so questionable and often hidden that what's the value here? Like, it's like propaganda value, I mean, and I guess that's my ultimate concern when people publicly talk about wargaming outcomes. It's propaganda, and who benefits from that? Well, if it's the ruling class, if it's the national security state, if it's militarists and jingos and ethno-nationalists and fucking defense contractors, then, like, that's not useful. Got to have good kind of propaganda, benefit the people. So that's all I got for now. Hopefully this was useful. I'm trying to get on Twitch on a more regular basis. The schedule is on the site, and I guess future episodes will not be necessarily as narrowly focused as this one. This was about one specific thing. But if you like me doing this kind of like the hot take layer on top of some boring ass think tank event, calling out the bullshit or whatever, I might do that some more. Let me know if that's your thing. So, all right. Well, that's going to do it for now.